I'm not going to honestly answer these questions. I don't think my work is sufficient to answer these questions, but it's kind of just a hook title, I guess. But I'll talk about two projects. One was part of my postdoctoral work looking at drivers of poaching of elephants across Africa, and then the other one was more focused on the greater Kruger system. It was nice to hear of someone from there. And I think you may even have been involved in funding this work, but I've never met you. And that's the second project. And a shout out to these amazing people. Sharon Hausman, particularly at the top left there, she runs an organization that works with Kruger and the private reserves surrounding Kruger and works on collaboration around common issues, one of which obviously is rhino poaching. Rhinos move freely between Kruger and these private reserves. Stephen Whitfield there, a regional ranger from Kruger as well. Sharon and Stephen, actually the originators of the Greater Kruger Project, in that they were looking at the poaching crisis and decided that we need to really start thinking critically in terms of evaluating what's been done to try and stop poaching and trying to understand what works, what hasn't, and under what conditions. And then E.J. Milner-Gulland, some of you will know her. She was my PhD supervisor. She's a phenomenal human being. She's a professor at Oxford University, and she brought me from being a very unconfident student to one who's much more confident. She believed in me more than I believed in myself, and she's continually helping with my projects. And then Professor Rez Altweg as well, Professor of Statistics at UCT, who helped with the elephant work. So first project, the CITES program, Mike, the monitoring of the illegal killing of elephants, operates at numerous sites across Africa and Asia. We focused on Africa here. This was, CITES approached EJ to do this work. She handed it on to me and supervised me. These are the sites over a period of almost 20 years. That's how many carcasses were detected by rangers. So the key thing about this program is it's rangers collecting data. And that's kind of become a real passion of mine and excitement about the knowledge that rangers have of the areas they patrol. This is just single data points, but they have a lot more knowledge about the systems they work in than pretty much anyone else. So this is just to show you that the population sizes of elephants vary widely across the different reserves, and so does the intensity of poaching. And we wanted to ask, why is poaching higher at some sites and in some years compared to others? It's a very difficult question to answer. The models we used didn't explain a huge amount of the variation in the data, but we did find some significant effects. We wanted to start first by generating hypotheses. And as a statistician, I really believe in kind of starting with a clear hypothesis, doing a bit of work before you run your statistical models, identifying data sets to represent your hypotheses, critically looking at the quality of those data sets. Are they representing what you want them to represent? And then only running the statistical model. And we found that to be a fruitful approach in this case. So these were some of the hypothesized factors. Many of you would probably have identified those ones as well. And this is just a quick picture of how we extracted some of those data. So this data set, the Global Data Lab, I think it's the University of Rotterdam, if I'm not mistaken, they've compiled incredible data sets at quite a fine spatial scale on socio-economic variables like human development and human wealth, human health. And we extracted those data to the areas surrounding the reserves. Uppsala University also curates an amazing data set on armed conflicts, and this one includes, the grey dots sadly are events that involved at least one death in an armed conflict, and then we extracted the data in close proximity and in time to the sites. And then we built a model, which I won't go into the details of, and these are the results. So I only have time to quickly show these two, this slide particularly. We found that reserves at which the surrounding communities had higher life expectancy and wealth scores, so that's the health index and the wealth index, tended to have lower poaching. Sites with greater law enforcement capacity, resources, money, had lower poaching, and interestingly, sites that were in countries that scored more poorly on governance quality indexes had higher levels of poaching. And the temporal trend in poaching across these 64 sites was correlated with the ivory price. There was an incredible new data set put together by Traffic on ivory prices over the last few decades. We found no clear effects of these other variables. Armed conflict was kind of on the fence. It's one of those difficult statistical ones where it looked like there was a relationship, but we were conservative in our interpretation of it. So there's a lot of caveats here, and these hypotheses are the ones that we found support for. But with these broad-scale correlative studies, this is not really getting at mechanisms necessarily. And so we're very cautious in how we interpret these results, although you'll see in a moment the headlines in the news that picked up on this story were not very cautious in their interpretations. So that's the paper that came out if you want to read it. And then I really didn't like the Economist's subtitle, "Poor, badly governed people is what causes elephant poaching." But if you read our paper, it doesn't really say that, but it's a nice title. I even spoke to the editor, and he kind of just stood by his thing and said, no, we still think it's a good title. But anyway, so then we went on to look at interventions to reduce rhino poaching in the Greater Kruger. And this is where, WWF and a few other organizations helped fund. It was a collaboration with Sandparks. I really enjoyed working with Sandparks colleagues like Stephen and others. And just to say, this was a project initiated by the managers, and I only came on later as kind of a scientist to help them do what they wanted to do. So it was manager-led research. We had tons and tons of workshops. Even after the results were released, to the group, we had to go up there again because there was a lot of disagreement and contestation over our findings. But we had to work hard to find middle ground, and it was a really nice experience to get to know the managers and their context. So it's a very complex thing we were trying to do, relates interventions to the intensity of poaching across these different reserves, 11 of them, and over 5 years. So just a background on the levels of poaching. Reserve 3 you'll probably recognize is Kruger, with the larger rhino numbers. But widely variable poaching rates, population sizes across these sites, and these are the kinds of things that were being implemented, including integrity testing, detection cameras, tracking dogs, and dehorning. But the strength of this project, I think, was that it was a combination of robust statistical analysis with some quasi-experimental design, but also recognizing the limitations of the data that we had in representing what we were trying to represent, and recognizing the need to engage managers in helping us measure these various interventions and interpret the results. And that led us to generate this kind of causal diagram as to how the different categories of intervention are supposed to reduce poaching, either preventing it in the first place, detecting poachers, leading to arrest. So in a nutshell, the statistical analysis was again correlative in seeing whether the intensity of the different interventions at the bottom was related to poaching levels across time and across the 11 reserves. So the first thing is just to highlight the costs. We didn't manage to go very deep into this in the paper, but a lot of money was spent. And unsurprisingly, the main budget item was staff. These staff obviously are not only doing rhino protection, but it is a huge part of their job in that landscape. And many staff are employed as a result. Access controls, air support, specialized detection technologies, and all sorts, wide variation in cost. So this is the unpopular slide because those bars represent the range of the effect statistically, the confidence interval for the effectiveness of each intervention. And if it overlaps 0, it means there was not conclusive evidence that intervention was correlated with less poaching. So as you can see, dehorning was the only one with strong evidence for effectiveness. This doesn't necessarily mean the other interventions were not effective. There's all sorts of reasons why they may not have come out as effective. We didn't have a very nice mix of sites with dogs and those without necessarily, but with dehorning we did have that. And it's very difficult to measure these interventions. So just a bit of caution in interpreting that. But we focused on the dehorning effect, which was just massive. Wherever dehorning was implemented, perhaps unsurprisingly, there was quite large reductions in poaching. And I think partly as a result of this work and other things, Izimvelo, Tlhotluemfolozi have dehorned all their rhinos, or they're just finishing up. And there's been massive reductions in poaching there, although it's very early days. So these other interventions, it's not like they're not working. The tracking dogs have achieved many poacher arrests. The detection cameras are detecting poachers, and there's allowing intervention before rhinos are killed. But the point is that high detections and arrests doesn't seem to be strongly correlated with reduced future poaching. And this is the wide area surveillance system that's used. It's a radar system, and again, achieving effective detections, and sometimes before the rhino was lost. So these are successful by one measure, but are they achieving long-term change to the whole system dynamics? It's less clear. So what does this all mean? Dehorning was the only intervention that acts, perhaps integrity testing as well, before the poacher enters the reserve. The suite of other interventions were all about what you do once the poacher's on the reserve, which I think is perhaps one of the weaknesses of those approaches. So our overall conclusion, one of them is that detecting and arresting poachers is not enough. I'm not saying it's not important that we just pull out rangers and dogs, but it seems that to make a step change in this space, something as drastic as dehorning, reducing the reward from poaching as opposed to increasing the risks, because there seems to be a large number of people willing to take that risk. And with corruption, there's ways around that risk, internal involvement, information about where rhinos are, where rangers are. And the court system as well is weak in that area. So yeah, thank you.